Okay, so three bits to this. The current landscape of where we are, our response to it over the last couple of years, which is, ambitious from nearly no resource and embryonic, but we think is at least has been a good experiment and it's worth dwelling on. And then finally, third, and which is the point at which we want you to respond, to elements of a new and alternative media system. Okay, so current landscape, just a very, very brief go around it. Commercial press is mostly establishment oriented in print and digital. We kind of know how it operates. We know how it leads other news agendas. We know kind of who owns most of it and why they're owning it and what messages they're wanting to put through it. BBC and Channel 4, I guess Channel 5 as well, but they're under a state charter to be plural and fair. Are they in practice? And I think the experience of us with mainstream media is that because we have so many other inputs, we can start to see agendas that are not thought about become explicit as we're watching supposedly judicious state and public news. So that's an experience that we have. What's happening in the spring is we're having two completely new broadcast players. Populist would be a gentle way to describe them. But one is called GB News, which is triggered by Andrew Neil, and the other one is competing with News UK, Rupert Murdoch. That's probably, I think they're probably looking at the role of Fox News in America, but I would suggest LBC in the UK as well. It's kind of setting the pace on what a kind of populist broadcast media would be like. So there's two new players in the field straight away. There's a wee bit of energy around what you could call progressive news titles. David pointed out that the new European title, which has an obvious constituency of Remainers, I guess, has just been bought by the ex-editor of the FT, Lionel Barber, with significant backing. We know things about like Byline News. We know how that operates as a kind of supercharged sort of private eye. Positive News is steadily putting out its perspectives. Atlas for the Future is one might mention. The way that The Guardian is quite successful in asking people to pay and donate for their digital services tied to every article. So that's the sort of the sort of official big scale landscape. And then if you move into the digital realm, beyond the bigger players and institutions, it becomes, we all know the craziness. I mean, I called it the cyclotron of official social media. But I think that one of the interesting things is that we know now that they make cash from our chaos. That's an old punk phrase, but they make money from polarizing opinion, which drives into clicks and also gives advertisers info about behavior. That drains that whole process in terms of what it does to us as citizens and as people, drains our energy, makes us manipulable, disempowers us. We're kind of onto that, but now, and now we can see post the coup attempt that they now explicitly filter and exclude, whereas they've been asked to before, but now they're explicitly doing it in a moment of crisis. So what's coming next with that? Is it new business models? Is it new competitors that answer some of our anxieties with social media? Is it a new wave of regulations? We don't know, but some change in that furious cycle of social media, structural change is definitely coming. And then alongside that, there's the darker element of that, the info wars, or the information wars, or the psyops, as you might call it, being perpetrated by various players, state, non-state, civil, covert, overt. And what they're doing is they're sending out truth stories, narratives that are useful or strategic. This is an old story. We know this is propaganda in the classic sense, but it's become really turbocharged at the moment. And there's also there's an element of what we call maybe digital opportunists who are exploiting what has been called, posh word, an epistemic crisis, but that's basically a crisis of truth. What do we think is true? What counts as true? Fake news is the official term. And people are working the conspiratorial thinking and feeling that's out there partly as a consequence of the disruptions of social media and the disruptions of our frameworks that social media have. And I think there's another element of thinking about news media, which I don't think is often really thought about in the same breath, but I'm calling it the land of affect and emotion, which comes from advertising, marketing, arts, popular culture. And there's a very deeply felt realism or consensus about what reality is that's constructed through advertising, marketing, arts, pop and culture every day. And I think it's an interesting question: to what degree is this emotional media, I would call it, just reacting to what it's finding, what it's market researching, in the wider audience, or to what extent is it creating and constructing, and can it do so? And there's a lot of reading. I've been doing a lot of reading into mind science and its relationship to how we deal with knowledge and truth. And the banal version of that is feels determines reals, or feels over reals. So I think we should be interested in what the role of the emotional affective background is to the news foreground, how the emotions help us to define and grasp the facts. I think that's a big factor in how we're thinking about our news media, and how do we intervene in that? What do we do? What kind of engagements do we get involved in? Do we go down to that level, or up to that level, or stay away from that level? It's an interesting question to me. So there's an attempt at the current landscape. How have we kind of responded to that as AUK? And I think it would be useful. This is not a trumpet blowing exercise. This is more, here we are. We've been prototyping and experimenting with different ways of responding to the crisis of media and the crisis of politics. How have we done that? Well, what we're generally trying to do is to tell a new story about ourselves, and through that story, imagine that a different future would be possible. So that's kind of our strapline. The New York Times, all the news that fits underneath its strapline, that's probably our strapline, to tell a new story about us and about a different future that's possible. So how have we done that? We've created, in the classic sense of journalism, because if you break down the word journalism, it means dailyism, something that's reported daily. We've tried to create a daily alternative. And that has generally been a sort of daily news and views service that commissions new stuff, curates stuff that's out there, aggregates sources that are out there. We've had an ambition, quite explicit, because Indra and I are both aware of sort of media studies and media theory and all that stuff. So we don't live in a world that says we don't have an agenda that sits behind the news. We accept that there are agendas behind news, and it's good to be aware of them as in they're operating. So we're asking people to live, feel, and act in this world, not that world. Is that positive news, or is it? We would say, is it human potential, human creativity news? That's something to discuss. But we're aware of that. We're aware of providing a news and view service that pulls people into a world that works for them and is different from the one that they're facing when they participate in the standard media. And we're trying to build a new political axis around that, which you may know if you've sampled our work, Ivy World, where the flourishing of individual, community, and planet are connected. So what's a news media? What's a cultural and information and emotional service that ties those things together? What we've also tried to do is to be taxonomizing from the beginning. And what I mean by taxonomizing is just categorizing every story so that makes an archive, so that archive can be really useful for people on the topics that are chosen. The Guardian does that probably best out of all the main providers, but we think that's a very useful thing to do. It's a way of being able to send people information about a kind of practice or a kind of take, and to taxonomize is to declare your agenda. And if you can see at the top there, that's a word cloud orchestrated on the basis of number of posts in each of those categories. And at the top is environmentalism, I think. I think below that is localism, fourth sector, community, new economics, artists, democratic innovation, personal development, big picture. So that immediately gives, is quite transparent about what it is that we're interested in, what our priorities are. And we think that's quite a good way to sort of do media. And just to say as well, just recently, oops, hold on, like that. We have we've tried to kind of create strong entry points to all this flow and archive of information that's oriented towards action. So the categories there are tell the story, shape the system, design democracy, and further on. And share learning, build economies, create the feel. So click into those and you're into a page which is a combination of information and action. So that's the point. We're trying to, as a media service, bring closer together the idea that action implies knowledge that you need to act, and that the knowledge itself is inert if you're not acting with it at the same time. Okay. And then we've tried to build digital public forums, which everybody tries to do. But we've tried to focus it on building community, getting that community to delivery, and then deciding an action. So we've used Lumio, which some of you may know is a kind of post-Occupy site. So it's very interested in the whole idea of groups coming together and forming their will and making things happen. It's accessible to those who come on to the alternative as co-creators. It's already a very, Indra maybe speak about this with more detail, but it's already a real crucible and petri dish for projects and initiatives. And then the other thing that we have taken advantage of is the whole Zoom culture, video culture, to create a regular forum called the Elephant Speaks. And again, these are speakers that are explicitly selected so that they have a systemic perspective, so they see the system and they want to change the system, and we've built up an archive for that. Okay. We've also really just tried not just to kind of fill the existing slots or containers of media, but try new things. We brought out an app, you'll remember, called Before and Now, which is an HTML5 app. It sits on the web. It doesn't require a lot of development. And that was gathering feelings from people who were downloading it and using it about the shift that COVID implied, the shift from before it happened until now. We also were experimenting with multimedia platforms in a project that we did with the local trust, which was about engaging with Plymouth communities around about their response to COVID around about sort of April, May, and really in a very ad hoc way, bolting together Google Docs, Zoom, Miro, which is a kind of whiteboard, shared whiteboard, even using AI, IBM Watson services to analyze content. And this was about how communities were coping with COVID, but it's possible to kind of bolt together something that looks like the sort of multimedia future just from bits that exist and with a bit of organization and goodwill. And we find ourselves talking to an awful lot of people who are digital platform system innovators, makers. And the question that we're partly here to discuss with you, but also are always discussing with them, is what shall we all do together? What are the bigger platforms and the bigger systems that we can piece together or agree to develop, as we sort of apprehend the crisis that we're in. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So just we're asking you and to initially as a kind of help as sort of friends and helpers, but we'll be asking much more widely, what happens if we look at all that pattern of activity with AU and AUK and decide to scale it up, times 2, times 10, times 100, even just the stuff that we're doing, if we find more buy-in from it from other communities and a range of funders or a better business model or revenue model, what could we do just on the basis of what we've started to do? But there's also things that we've not even really tried. We've not really dabbled in podcasts. There's a whole question about meme making, which again it has an interesting relationship to the crisis of news and truth. If feels beats reels or feels sits before reels, then how do you responsibly, creatively, positively engage in that meme war rather than not, or do you simply not get involved in that level of activity because it is too risky, or it can go down the wrong route or be misused it's a thing. It's a point to discuss, I think. So, so that's how we've responded to the current landscape crisis of media. I'd like to conclude, and then maybe get you to sort of respond to all of this, but particularly to this bit about what it suggests for elements of a new and alternative media system. So again, this is my theme. If you've got other themes you think are as important, please tell us. But I think we need strategies for feels as well as reals. And being self-conscious about how consuming media creates a world for you, what does that imply? How do we respond to that if we are, anxious about the climate crisis, if we're anxious about the pandemic, if we believe we're in a technological revolution that's going to distribute people in different levels of equality and inequality and potentiality? If we believe that's the crisis we're in, what's the media that's appropriate to that, and is a media that's about creating a world for you in which you can positively act? One answer. So what does that imply practically? I wonder whether we have we should be thinking about bold, beautiful, powerful new news brands, which is also enterprises and services. And I was just thinking about the names of the news services that exist that maybe are trying to sort of tilt against the current consensus. Tortoise, Correspondent, Byline, Canary, Double Down, Open Democracy. Does that really cut it? And do we what might we be thinking about in terms of bold, affective, emotionally confident news and media brands? What could that be? Could it be as bold as XR was? The other thing I think about a lot is I took up a subscription to a magazine called Creative Review, which I'm sure Phil knows pretty well, and it's just like a torrent of beautiful design and art coming from the advertising sector, and some of it is aware of the wider crisis that we're all in. Some of it just simply isn't. But the stuff that is often I gaze on it with amazement, and I think that's amazing that's happening. I wonder if it could be, it could be in the service of something more powerful, more activist, rather than just as a kind of display of skill. So, how do we get more free creativity from the creative sector? How do we talk to the creative sector and say, that the state of the crisis that we're in, how perceptions and moods and frameworks are incredibly important in terms of helping people to act in the face of these crises. What can you bring? And how that's paid for or not paid for, how that's donated or leased is an interesting question to me. But there's the actual experience of editing the Daily Alternative is that there is an absolute, torrent of activity, a torrent of creativity that could be better used and more justly used. And I'm trying to figure out ways in which that might happen. And I'm going to invite you to think about that as well. And then the other big question, just to finish, is, hold on a minute. Okay. Is basically elements of a new media system, which is the question of how media is organized, who it involves, what it does with its data, will have a big effect on its content. So if the media is run as a cooperative or a mutual, if it's run in a commoning way, we can talk about what that means. If it's done in a cooperative, participative way with content makers and with content users, could it generate what the media theorist Dan Hine calls a non-manipulative media sector, a part of the media landscape which you go to in order to behave quite differently as a content maker and quite differently as a content user? And is the structure of that media crucial to that different experience and those different agendas of media? And then I think the other thing, in terms of organisation, we need to be constantly investigating new investment systems, new ways of finding ways to pay for media, being aware of our media spend as individuals as a pie chart, deciding that bits of that pie are going to go to particular endpoints, being explicitly talking to people about what they are spending. And then finally, is there a different way to talk to philanthropists in the way that there seems to be, and actually capital as well, big capital as well, because there seem to be pennies dropping about climate reality and the need to shift investment in a strong direction that way. Could we begin to have an argument with these people about the human ecology, which is even more important in terms of getting people to behave in a planet-friendly way, and the media element of that, the shaping of feeling and fact, and the addressing of the appetite for that is, I would say, just as or even more important than shifting energy investments. So how do we begin to talk to philanthropists about investing in an alternative new media system?